Hey there, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we bring you a chilling collection of horror stories set against the soothing sound of rain. Before we dive into suspense, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If these stories send shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear slowly take over, and tell us if you enjoy this kind of storytelling. Now sit back and relax, we're about to begin. The unexplained loss of time. Have you ever felt like hours of your life just disappeared? Like you've missed something but you can't figure out what? That gnawing feeling creeping into your thoughts, making you question everything. Was it a mistake? Or worse, was it something else? I had that feeling and it hit me with such intensity, I couldn't shake it for days. I sat on my couch staring at the clock, unsure of when or how it had gotten so late. The day had passed me by in a blur, but I couldn't remember any of it. No distinct moments. No flashes of what I'd done, where I'd been, or even who I had spoken to. It wasn't just that I didn't remember. It was the unsettling sense that I had been somewhere, doing something important, but the memory was lost. Like someone had erased it. I'm not the type to forget things. I've always been aware of every minute, every hour of my life. But this was different. It wasn't a forgotten memory, it was more like a gaping hole in time. I had been at work. I'm sure of that. I can remember the small things, the smell of coffee brewing in the break room, the hum of the office printer. But everything else is foggy. The last thing I remember was walking out of the building, the city streets bustling around me, the usual sounds of traffic and voices. And then nothing. My next clear memory was of sitting back down at my desk, but it was hours later. I looked at my phone. There were several messages, but none of them helped me make sense of what had happened. I hadn't heard my phone ring. The messages were simple, just the usual check-ins. Nothing that made me feel like I'd missed something critical. But still, something felt wrong. A low, incessant hum filled the room. It was faint, almost like the air itself was vibrating. At first, I thought it was the refrigerator or perhaps the air conditioning unit, but when I got up to check, I realized it wasn't either. The hum didn't come from a physical source, it was just there, surrounding me. It unnerved me. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing, but it was persistent. Like it was an undercurrent to my thoughts, a presence in the room. I walked to the window and looked out. The street outside was still busy, people walking, cars driving past. But something felt lost. The world felt muted, disconnected, like I was seeing it through a fogged window. The colors seemed duller, the sounds quieter. My thoughts circled back to that gap in time. How much had I lost? How many hours had I missed without even knowing it? I tried to shake the feeling, to dismiss it as stress or tiredness. I'd been working long hours recently. Maybe I just needed rest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. The air around me felt heavier now, like the weight of something was pressing in from every corner. It wasn't a physical weight, but a mental one, a sense that something wasn't right. And then I heard it again, the faint sound of something shifting, moving. A creak, a whisper, At first, I thought it was the old wooden floorboards, but no. This was different. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Still, silent, except for the hum. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the apartment. But the air was thick, and that feeling of being watched returned. The feeling that something was there, even if I couldn't see it. I glanced at the clock again. The hands moved, but they didn't seem right. It was as if time itself was warped. Hours had passed, but I didn't know how. I couldn't make sense of it. I felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to figure out what had happened, what I had missed. What I wasn't seeing. I stood up and walked to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My body stiffened and my heart pounded. The sound, a whisper soft at first, but growing clearer. It wasn't coming from the air. It wasn't the hum. It was coming from the hallway. I stepped back slowly, my pulse racing. The sound, it wasn't a voice, but something else. Something I couldn't quite identify. It was faint, but unmistakable. I held my breath and listened. It was closer now. It was moving. And then it stopped. Silence. A complete silence. The hum was gone. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then slowly, as though in response, I felt something shift in the room with me. A change in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, but it grew. The very fabric of the room felt stretched, pulled in strange ways. I turned back to the door, and for a moment I wondered if I should leave. But where would I go? The world outside seemed distant, out of reach. What if it followed me? What if it was already there, waiting for me to step out? I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself, to convince myself this was just stress. But when I opened them, everything had changed. The room, the hallway, the world beyond my door was different. It wasn't just a sense of time lost anymore. Something had shifted, something that wasn't visible but was there. And that's when I knew. It wasn't just the hours I had lost. It was me. I had changed too. But the question still haunted me. Had this been my mind? Or had something taken me? Something I didn't understand. Something I wasn't supposed to see. The door creaked. Just a little. The whisper returned. We're waiting for you. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. It was closer now. The gap in time. The loss. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a feeling. It was real. And it was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The air around me thickened, pressing down on my chest. My heart thudded wildly, and my mind raced to make sense of what was happening. I stood frozen, staring at the door as the whisper continued to echo, getting louder, more insistent. The world outside had become a distant memory, and now it was just me and whatever that was lurking behind the door. The whisper wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, an invisible weight that felt like it was pressing into the walls, into my skin. It was as if the very air around me had become infected, carrying some unseen force that made everything feel. Wrong. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, but before I could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. The whisper stopped abruptly. There was a silence that was almost worse than the sound. I didn't move. The hallway outside was dark, unnervingly so. I could make out the dim outlines of the walls, but beyond that, there was only shadow. The apartment seemed to be expanding, stretching into the unknown. It was as if the hallway wasn't even part of the building anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong. It felt like I was standing at the edge of some kind of abyss. I stood there, caught between curiosity and terror. Was I supposed to step out there? Was I supposed to face whatever was waiting? Or was it safer to stay inside, locked away from whatever was trying to pull me into that darkness? I couldn't stay in here. The silence was deafening, and the oppressive weight of the unknown pushed me toward the door. Some instinct compelled me to move. I stepped forward cautiously, my footsteps muffled on the soft carpet. The floor felt wrong underfoot, too smooth, too distant. It was like walking on something that wasn't quite solid. As I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold draft curled around my ankles, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. My breath came out in visible puffs, even though I hadn't opened a window. The hallway was longer than it had been. I was sure of it. I had walked this apartment countless times, but now it stretched on, far beyond the usual length. The walls were warped, their edges soft and blurry, like they were melting into the air. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I reached out, instinctively trying to steady myself, but my fingers brushed the wall. The surface was cold, slick, like wet glass. I pulled my hand away quickly, but it didn't feel wet. It was just wrong, and then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the door to the stairwell stood open. But it wasn't just open. There was something on the other side. A faint silhouette, dark against the dim light that seeped through the door. At first, I thought it was a person. A figure waiting, watching me. But as I stared at it, the shape seemed to shift, to bend and blur, like it couldn't quite hold its form. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper returned, but this time it was more than just a sound. It was a presence in my head, a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through my skull. Come closer. The words were more than just an invitation, they were a command. They rang through my mind like a chorus of voices, layered over each other until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, to run, to lock myself in my room and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. It was like something was pulling me forward, something invisible and yet all-encompassing. I took a tentative step, then another, my feet dragging through the thick, oppressive air. With each step, the whisper grew louder, clearer, until I could hear each word as though it was being whispered directly into my ear. We've been waiting for you. I stopped. The words reverberated in my chest. I felt something shift in the air around me, like the very space I occupied was warping. The world outside this hallway, outside this apartment, was fading. Fading into something else. The temperature dropped again, and I could feel the chill biting at my skin. I shivered involuntarily, but I couldn't stop. Something was pulling me, something beyond my control. And the whisper wasn't stopping. It was like a magnetic force, drawing me closer to that dark doorway where the shadow waited. I reached the stairwell door and placed my hand on the cold metal. It wasn't the same door that had been there before. This one felt wrong. It vibrated beneath my touch, like it was alive, like it was something that shouldn't exist in the world I knew. I hesitated, torn between the urge to turn back and the unbearable pull toward the unknown. The whisper grew louder, more desperate. It seemed to be pleading with me now. Come closer. Don't be afraid. But I was afraid. I was terrified. I slowly pushed the door open. The dim light from the stairwell flickered, and I stepped through. The air was heavier here, denser, as though I was descending into something that didn't belong in reality. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, swallowing the light in a way that felt wrong. I descended one step, then another. The feeling of time was slipping away. The seconds felt like hours, and yet they moved too quickly. I glanced up, expecting to see the apartment door behind me, but it was gone. The hallway, the apartment, everything I had known was fading. It was only me and the shadows now. You don't belong here, the whisper said, but now it wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, an overwhelming sense that I was no longer in control. I had stepped into something else, something that didn't follow the rules of time or space. The figure at the end of the stairwell was moving now, its shape folding and warping as it stepped toward me. And I knew with a cold certainty that there was no going back. I couldn't move. The figure at the bottom of the stairwell, what I had first thought was a person, was no longer just a shape in the darkness. It had transformed. Its edges were no longer clear, they were shifting, almost like they were made of smoke or liquid. It flickered in and out of focus, as if the very act of observing it was causing it to destabilize. My breath quickened, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to turn around and escape this place, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. It was as if the air itself had thickened and was holding me in place. The thing in the stairwell moved again, but this time it was faster. One moment it was there in front of me, the next gone. It was like it could bend space itself, like it existed beyond the confines of the building. I heard a sound, a soft scraping, as if something was dragging across the floor, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from me. My own footsteps, echoing in the emptiness, were the only things that connected me to this strange, warped reality. I stepped back, hoping to regain some sense of control over my body, but when my foot hit the step behind me, I froze. The stairwell wasn't like it had been just moments before. The stairs themselves seemed to stretch, elongating impossibly into the abyss below. The walls, once solid and familiar, were now trembling, like they were vibrating with an energy I couldn't comprehend. It felt like time itself had been twisted here, and I was caught in the middle of it. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the strange, oppressive silence that had fallen. The figure didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The weight of its presence was enough. A low hum filled the air, starting softly but growing louder. It was the same buzzing sound I had heard earlier, the one that felt like it was inside my skull. The figure twitched, and for a brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Its shape, which had been shifting, solidified into something grotesque, a twisted version of a person with too many limbs, too many eyes. The eyes were the worst. They were wide and unblinking, staring right at me. The eyes seemed to pierce through me, as if they could see every fear, every doubt, every dark thought I had ever hidden. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. There was no air. My lungs were tightening as though they were being squeezed by an invisible hand. "You don't belong here," the whisper came again, this time louder. And then, as if to confirm my growing suspicion, it added, "You never did." The hallway behind me had disappeared entirely. I turned around, and what I saw was nothing. No door, no walls, just an endless void stretching out in every direction. I was completely alone with this thing. No escape, no way out. And yet something inside me, some primal instinct, told me that I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay still. I couldn't allow this thing to close the distance between us. Every part of me screamed to turn around and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was as if it was drawing me in, like I was trapped in a web of its creation. I stumbled backward one step, then another. I barely felt the stairs beneath me anymore. The space around me had become a blur, and I realized with growing horror that I was no longer sure where I was. The building, the stairwell, it all felt unreal. The walls were pulsing with some unseen force, the lights flickering as though they were struggling to keep their shape. The air was thickening again, heavier with each passing second. The shadowy figure didn't move anymore. It had stopped in place, its eyes still locked on mine, unblinking, relentless. "You can't leave," it whispered. "You can never leave." I felt a jolt of panic rip through me. I needed to escape. I had to escape. I turned and bolted down the stairs, ignoring the voice in my head that told me running was pointless. The stairs beneath me blurred with each step, and I began to feel dizzy. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating through my bones, shaking me to the core. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running toward, but I couldn't let it get closer. Suddenly, the stairwell twisted again. The stairs seemed to spiral in on themselves, bending like a Möbius strip, never ending, going both up and down at the same time. My heart raced, my head spinning, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing against me from all sides. I was caught in a loop. A deafening crack echoed through the space, and I looked up to see the ceiling above me shatter. Fragments of light broke through the cracks, spilling into the space like a broken mirror. I gasped, my hands reaching out, trying to grasp at something, anything, to steady myself. But nothing was solid. The whole world felt like it was falling apart around me. "You'll never wake up," the voice said, this time unmistakably closer. "You'll never remember." The ground beneath me trembled. I fell forward, my body slamming into the stairs, the air knocked out of my lungs. As I pushed myself up, I saw the figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, now closer than ever. Its many eyes stared down at me, all at once, unblinking. I could feel them, each one piercing into me, suffocating me. I reached for the railing, but my hand passed through it as though it was made of smoke. The reality around me was warping further, collapsing into itself. And then everything stopped. The figure was gone. The hum faded. The space around me was still, almost too still. I stood there panting, my chest heaving, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was back at the top of the stairs again, staring at the same door that had first opened into this nightmare. It was as if no time had passed at all. But I knew it had. The seconds, the minutes, they had slipped away. Somewhere in some part of my mind, I realized that whatever had just happened, I had lost more than time. I had lost something deeper, something I couldn't name. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to find it again. I stood there trembling, my body aching from the fall, my mind reeling. The stairwell, quiet still, almost unnervingly so, stared back at me like an empty eye socket. The door, the same one I had passed through earlier, stood just ahead, but it felt impossibly distant now, as if it were on the other side of some invisible boundary I couldn't cross. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, makes it hard to breathe, hard to think. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the world around me refused to focus. It was as though everything was in a state of flux, a blur between one reality and another. The edges of the stairwell seemed to waver like a mirage, and every sound felt muffled as if I were underwater. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel it in my throat, but the silence around me only made everything feel more suffocating. The buzzing hum that had followed me, that had been so insistent, had stopped, but in its place was a different kind of pressure, one that squeezed against my temples, my skull. Was this real? I reached up to touch my face, half expecting to feel cold sweat or blood, but there was nothing. Just the hollow sense of wrongness that had settled over me, deeper now than before. The space, the stairwell, felt empty, like a shell with no substance. I couldn't remember how I had ended up here, or when, for that matter. My mind was a fog, clouded by too many gaps, too many pieces missing. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the stairwell again, looking for any sign of movement. The stairs beneath me seemed the same, worn, dusty, but there was something about them, something off now. They were too familiar and yet too strange. The walls, once solid and dependable, felt like they were breathing, contracting, expanding in time with my pulse. I should have left. I knew that. But there was something inside me, something dark and persistent that kept pushing me forward. It was almost as if something was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs. And somehow I knew that I had to go down. But there was no way to explain why I felt that way. The sound of my footsteps when I finally moved seemed to echo unnaturally, like I was walking in a cavern. I gripped the railing, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warm, stale air around me. The further I descended, the more my body seemed to resist, but my mind was fascinated by this. I couldn't help myself. It was as though something had taken hold of me, a force I couldn't shake off. I couldn't remember my life before this moment. What had I been doing? Where had I been? How long had I been stuck here, in this strange loop of time and reality? These questions gnawed at me, but there was no answer, only more silence. I reached the bottom of the stairs. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I hesitated. Something was off. Something felt wrong about this door, about everything. Then, just as I was about to turn the knob, I heard it again. That scraping sound, the same as before. Soft at first, but growing louder, closer. It was coming from somewhere behind me, from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I whipped around, expecting to see it again, the figure from earlier, but nothing was there. Just the darkened stairwell, stretching endlessly in both directions. Yet I could feel it, the presence, just out of sight. My pulse quickened. Then, without warning, the air around me shifted. It wasn't a sudden change, it was gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniable. The temperature dropped, the air growing colder, sharper. The silence was broken by a low, deep groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. The lights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that crept along the walls, reaching toward me. For a moment I could have sworn I saw something moving in the dark, something large, something alive, but when I blinked, it was gone. I could feel my breath coming faster, shallow now, like I was running out of air. The humming had returned, this time even louder, vibrating through the very core of the building. It was as if the entire place was alive, like it was breathing, pulsating with some unseen energy. I reached for the door handle again, my fingers trembling as I twisted it. It clicked open easily, as if it had been waiting for me to take that step. What was on the other side? I stepped through, and the world around me seemed to warp once again. The hallway stretched on impossibly long, the walls buckling and shifting in ways they shouldn't. The door I had just opened felt wrong now, like it wasn't supposed to be there at all. I looked down at the floor. The tiles had cracked, and the cracks were spreading, snaking out in all directions. They looked like veins, like they were bleeding some kind of dark liquid. I backed away from the door instinctively, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get out of here, but my feet refused to move. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure standing in the shadows. Tall, impossibly tall. Its face, if it even had one, was obscured by the darkness. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything, not clearly. But it was there, its presence suffocating, pressing down on me. And in that moment, I understood something. Something terrible. Whatever this was, this place, this thing, it wasn't just toying with me. It was trying to consume me. To erase me, to erase everything about me. And I didn't know if I could stop it. I didn't know if I could even escape. The figure moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it simply shifted, appearing closer with each blink. And with that movement, the world around me seemed to shudder, as though it was breaking apart at the seams. I had to move. I had to get away. But where? The hallway was endless. There was nowhere to run. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. It felt like my mind was starting to splinter, like reality itself was beginning to fracture. The figure grew larger, looming over me now, and I could hear it. It's breathing. Slow, deep, inhuman. You can't run, it whispered, its voice a soundless murmur that scraped at my mind. I could feel it closing in. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse around me, the world snapped. The world snapped, and for a moment, everything went black. I couldn't feel my body. I couldn't hear anything. There was no light, no sound, just an overwhelming sense of being nowhere. It was as if I had ceased to exist. The weight of nothingness pressed against me, as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled and left me adrift in some void, alone. I don't know how long I was there, suspended in the dark, unable to move, to think. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. It was as though the concept of time itself had become irrelevant. My mind, my very existence, seemed to have faded into the abyss. But then slowly things began to return. It wasn't immediate. The darkness ebbed away like the fading remnants of a bad dream, and I could feel my body again, the cold air against my skin, the sharpness of the ground beneath me. My eyes snapped open. I was lying on the floor. It wasn't the stairwell anymore. The walls around me were different, gray, chipped, old, and decaying. The floor was a cold concrete slab covered in dust. I could taste the metallic tang of something stale in the air, and a musty smell clung to the space. This place felt abandoned, forgotten. But there was something else, something alive. I sat up, my head spinning. The throbbing in my skull was unbearable, like my brain was trying to escape through my eyes. My heartbeat echoed in my chest, and I struggled to steady myself, placing my hands on the cold floor for support. I needed to think, to make sense of what had happened. I needed to know where I was. I looked around. The room was dark, but there was a dim light from somewhere above, flickering weakly. The shadows cast by the light stretched unnaturally, as if they too were afraid to be seen fully. The silence was oppressive, thick, suffocating. But something wasn't right. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. As I took a step forward, I felt a familiar cold draft, and my eyes were drawn to a crack in the wall on my left. The crack snaked up toward the ceiling, jagged like a scar. It was impossible to ignore. The walls themselves seemed to pulse faintly, just enough to be unsettling. They weren't solid, they weren't real in the way walls should be. I hesitated, but something compelled me to move. Something deeper than fear. It was like the place was pulling me, calling me to explore it, to understand what had happened. I stumbled toward the crack in the wall, my feet dragging, unwilling to move as quickly as my mind demanded. The closer I got, the more I noticed. The crack wasn't just a crack, it was a path, a route, a way through. The darkness seemed to swallow the edges of it, like the crack was a doorway into something that wasn't supposed to exist. But what if it was the only way out? The decision to follow it was as natural as breathing. It wasn't a conscious thought, it was just a feeling that I had no control over. Like the building was guiding me, pulling me forward. I pressed my hand against the wall, the coldness of it seeping into my skin, and slowly, cautiously, I stepped into the crack. The space was narrow, but just wide enough for me to fit. My heart hammered in my chest, louder than before. The air was colder here, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step. I moved through the narrow passageway, barely able to see ahead. The walls closed in around me, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on me. The air grew denser, colder. It wasn't just the temperature that had changed, it was the feeling, the vibe of the place. It felt wrong, like it wasn't just an abandoned building, but a space that was never meant to be. The further I went, the more I began to feel it again, the presence. That thing, the figure that had haunted me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I hadn't seen it. It was there in the shadows, just beyond my sight. The walls seemed to close in tighter as I moved forward. The path twisted and turned, winding like a labyrinth. I could feel myself losing my bearings. How long had I been walking? Had I been walking in circles? Then, as I rounded a corner, the passage opened up into a large, circular room. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary storage room, empty boxes, old wooden crates, and a few scattered pieces of broken furniture. But there was something off about it, something unnatural. In the center of the room was a mirror. It stood taller than me, its surface dark and reflective, but not in the way a normal mirror would be. It didn't reflect the room, it reflected nothing. Just blackness, deep and endless. I stood frozen, staring at it, unable to look away. Something in that mirror. It called to me. It was almost as if it wanted me to look into it, wanted me to see what it held. I took a cautious step toward it, then another, my hands trembling as they reached out for the cold glass. The instant my fingers made contact, I felt it, a sharp, searing jolt of pain, as if the mirror had burned my skin. I yanked my hand away, stumbling back. The mirror. It was alive. And before I could comprehend what was happening, I saw it. The figure. The same one from the stairwell, the one that had haunted me since this nightmare began. But now, in the mirror, it was different. It was distorted, its face warped and twisted, like it was made of darkness itself. Its eyes, they were the same as before, unblinking, endless. It grinned at me not with malice, but with something much worse. Something empty. I could feel my breath hitching in my throat as I backed away from the mirror, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me. Its grin widening, stretching impossibly wide, as if it were mocking me. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. The hum, that constant noise, returned louder than ever, vibrating in my chest. The walls, the floor, the very air around me seemed to pulse in time with it. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. But where was the door? Where was the way back? I turned to look behind me, and the passage I had just come through was gone. There was nothing but endless darkness. The mirror, the figure, it was all that existed now. And somehow I knew it wasn't going to let me leave. Not until it had taken everything. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, pressing it against the glass. I watched, horrified, as the glass rippled, as though it was a pool of water disturbed by the touch. It was going to reach out. I could feel it. I could feel the pull, the force. It was dragging me in. And I realized too late that I had lost more than just time. I had lost myself. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty streets, a rhythmic tapping that felt too loud in the quiet night. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved me, it was what lay beneath it. I had walked these streets countless times before, but tonight felt different. It wasn't just the chill in the air, or the way the wind howled through the narrow alleys, tugging at my coat. It was something else. Something old. What was it that was watching me? The question lingered in my mind, chasing me as I walked past the rows of buildings. The old buildings. The ones with cracked windows and crumbling bricks, like they were slowly eroding away beneath the weight of the years. I could feel the weight of their presence, as if they knew something I didn't. As if they were waiting for me. It had started as a habit, these late-night walks. Something about the city at night, its shadows and silence, had always drawn me in. Maybe it was the solitude that appealed to me, the quiet I couldn't find during the day when the world was too noisy and the people too close. But tonight, the usual comfort of walking through the abandoned streets was gone. The air was colder than it should have been, the chill biting through my jacket. I pulled it tighter around me, quickening my pace, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something that wasn't there. The buildings around me felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The narrow alleyways between them seemed to pulse with some unseen energy, and the windows, they were different tonight. They seemed to watch me. I had always felt an odd connection to those windows, but tonight it was as if they were alive, moving with the rhythm of my footsteps. I stopped for a moment, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. There was a faint whisper, soft at first, but it grew clearer, more distinct. The sound was coming from the direction of the old apartment building across the street. I stared at the building, the one with boarded-up windows and the peeling paint. It had been abandoned for years, yet something about it tonight felt wrong. I didn't know why, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. It's just the wind, I told myself, but my heart was racing. There was a tremor in my hand as I reached for my phone, checking the time, 2:43 a.m. The night had never felt so endless. And then I heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too specific. It sounded like a voice, soft and hushed, just on the edge of my hearing. Come closer. I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, as though it was meant for me alone. It sent a shiver down my spine, a coldness that ran straight through me, from my skin to my bones. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. No one but the shadows stretching out across the cracked pavement. I shouldn't have gone closer, but something compelled me to move. It was as if the building was calling me, drawing me in, and I couldn't resist. My feet carried me across the street, my steps unsure, hesitant. The closer I got, the clearer the voice became, though it still wasn't quite audible. It was more like a murmur, buried under layers of time and dust, but somehow it felt like it was inside my head. Like it was inside me. You haven't forgotten, have you? The voice was a soft rasp now, echoing in my mind. I stopped in front of the apartment building, looking up at its dark, broken windows. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement, but the whispers persisted, wrapping around me like a cold fog. The building felt like it had always been here. A part of the city's history. Its walls, aged and cracked, seemed to carry the weight of the past, of forgotten stories and lost voices. I could almost hear them, the stories, coming from behind the walls. The whispers, the secret. Suddenly the streetlights flickered again. But this time it wasn't just the lights. The shadows moved. They twitched and jerked as if something was trying to break through, reaching for me. My pulse quickened. You need to listen. The voice was louder now, but it didn't come from anywhere specific. It was everywhere. It was the wind, it was the trees, it was the shadows themselves. My breathing grew heavier and I stepped back, almost falling onto the curb. I needed to leave. This wasn't normal. But as I turned to walk away, something stopped me. A flicker in the window. A shape. It was too quick to catch at first, but it was there. A face. A pale, distorted face, watching me from behind the broken glass. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but the figure didn't move. It didn't blink. It was just there. Watching. Waiting. You've heard the stories. The voice was soft, but now there was no mistaking its source. It was coming from within the building, from deep within its hollowed-out core. The building itself was alive, breathing with the weight of the past, and the voices of those long gone were starting to resurface. I couldn't escape the feeling. The building was calling me. The whispers, they were getting louder. I needed to leave, but somehow I couldn't make myself move. I should have run. Every part of my body screamed at me to turn and go, to leave behind the chilling whispers and the unnerving gaze of the shadowed figure in the window. But my feet refused to obey. It was like some unseen force had rooted me to the spot, forcing me to stand there in the dead of night, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispering voice continued, its tone more insistent now, almost pleading. Come closer, listen to the stories you remember, don't you? I wasn't sure what it meant by that. Stories? What stories? I had no idea what the voice was referring to. I had never been one to indulge in the past, never one to dwell on things I couldn't change. I always preferred to move forward, to leave behind old wounds and broken memories. But there was something about the voice, something hauntingly familiar. It felt like it was pulling me into the building, coaxing me to uncover something hidden. Something long forgotten. The window was empty now. No face, no figure. Just the same cracked glass, staring back at me like a dead eye. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to writhe, twisting as though they had minds of their own. The air, thick with moisture and the smell of damp wood, seemed to close in on me. I stepped closer. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, clearer than before. The sound of it seeped into my mind, burrowing beneath the surface of my thoughts like an invasive worm. You have to know. You have to understand. I froze mid-step, the cold creeping up my spine. The voice had changed. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, overlapping, blending together. Male, female, young, old. The voices felt as though they were coming from every crack in the walls, every corner of the building, as though the entire structure itself was speaking to me. It's in the walls. It's in the windows. It's in your blood. My hand shot out, gripping the rusted handle of the building's front door. It was cold, unnaturally so, as though the door had been waiting for my touch. My fingers trembled as I twisted the knob, the old metal creaking in protest. The door swung open with a slow, groaning sound, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was impossible to tell how deep it went. The shadows swallowed any light that tried to penetrate. I stood there paralyzed. I shouldn't go in. This isn't normal. But the whispering, the voices, they were too compelling. They drew me in like a moth to a flame, and I couldn't resist their pull. Stepping inside, I was immediately hit by the staleness of the air. The smell of decay was overwhelming, as if the building had been abandoned for decades. Yet there was something alive in the atmosphere, something that hummed just below the surface. The walls felt too close, the space too cramped, as though they were slowly closing in around me. I took a hesitant step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. The whispers grew louder as I moved, following me, echoing from all directions. You're here, you remember. The words were like a mantra, repeated over and over, getting louder and louder until they felt like they were pressing on my skull. My head throbbed in response, the sensation almost unbearable. I stumbled down the dark hallway, the walls seeming to pulse with each step I took. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the air, forming clouds of fog that quickly vanished into the stillness. There were no doors, no windows, just a narrow corridor stretching endlessly before me, flanked by walls that seemed to bend and twist in unnatural angles. It felt like the building itself was alive, breathing, watching. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the doorway, there was a flicker. On shape. It was a figure standing motionless in the gloom, its back to me. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel its presence, heavy, oppressive, like it was waiting for something. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my fate wouldn't move. The whispers had grown louder still, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. It's coming, it remembers, it's all connected. The figure at the end of the hallway turned slowly, its head jerking unnaturally, as if it had been waiting for me all along. Its face, there was no face. Just a smooth, featureless mask of pale skin. Empty, hollow. The air seemed to vibrate with its gaze, even though it had no eyes to see me with. It was as if the very space around it was suffocating, closing in tighter with each passing second. I couldn't breathe. The temperature had dropped so low that I could feel the frost on my skin, even through my jacket. And then the voice. The voice that had been whispering all along, now sounding like a distant echo from the very depths of the building. Come closer, we are waiting. My legs finally responded, taking a shaky step backward. But it was too late. The building groaned, its walls trembling as though it were alive, shifting in response to something ancient stirring within. You can't leave. The floor beneath my feet cracked, a deep rumble shaking the entire building. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to stretch, the door I had entered through vanishing as if it never existed. The walls seemed to close in, pushing me further down the hallway toward the figure, whose featureless face was now impossibly close. You can't escape the past. The floor beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling into the darkness. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. My vision blurred, a black void swallowing everything around me. For a few moments, all I could hear was the deafening roar of my pulse in my ears, my breath shallow and ragged as I struggled to steady myself. I tried to sit up, but my body felt weightless, as if the very ground beneath me was shifting, undulating. I couldn't tell if the floor was solid or if I was floating above it. Panic surged through me, a sharp coldness gripping my chest as I fumbled to push myself up. My fingers scraped against something rough like stone, but there was no solid foundation. Only shadows, deep, suffocating shadows that seemed to pull at me from all directions. I wasn't alone. The air around me thickened, charged with an oppressive heaviness. There was a sound, distant but unmistakable, like the creak of old wood groaning under pressure. The kind of sound a house makes when it's settling after years of silence. But this was different. This wasn't a building settling. This was a warning. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, but it was unmistakable. It slipped through the dark, curling into my ears like a snake. You came. You shouldn't have come. I froze. The voice was the same, but this time it wasn't just one. It was multiple voices, layered over each other, a chorus of tortured souls all speaking in unison. The sound of it scraped at my mind, digging into the crevices of my sanity, chipping away at the edges of reality. Come closer, you have to see. I looked around, desperate for some sign of where the voice was coming from, but all I saw was endless blackness, the shadows stretching further than I could comprehend. The whispers were everywhere, inside me, around me, beneath me. The air itself seemed to vibrate with them. My heart raced. I had to get out. I had to. It's too late. It's always been too late. The words rang out louder now, almost deafening. And then an explosion of sound. A sudden sharp crack. The floor beneath me shifted violently, and I felt the ground give way. My stomach lurched as I fell, tumbling through the endless void. It felt like time had stretched, the sensation of falling dragged on far longer than it should have, as if the very fabric of space had been distorted. I crashed into something hard, stone, or maybe wood. My body ached, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the cold, by the relentless whispers that continued to echo around me. My skin prickled with fear as the air seemed to close in tighter, suffocating me. And then a figure appeared. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness, an indistinct shadow moving in and out of my vision, but soon it became clearer. A tall, thin silhouette, too tall, too thin. It loomed over me, its outline shifting as if it were made of smoke, yet somehow solid. Its presence was undeniable, suffocating. It was there, and it was watching. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't even scream. The air felt heavy in my lungs, as if something was pressing down on my chest, pushing the air out of me. The figure tilted its head, and a cold, guttural laugh echoed through the void, shaking the very ground beneath me. I could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes. It saw me. It knew me. You think you can escape the past. The voice came from it, or maybe it was just a part of the air itself. The tone was low and rasping, like something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries and was now waking up. Slowly, relentlessly. You can't escape what's already been written. My breath came in gasps as the figure moved closer, its shape blurring in and out of focus, like it was flickering in and out of reality. There was no face, no discernible features, just a dark void where its head should have been. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bending at unnatural angles, as if it were made of something that didn't belong in this world. The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were inside my skull, scratching and clawing, trying to get out. I clenched my eyes shut, but the darkness pressed in on me, suffocating. I had to escape. I had to. You think you can run. The voice was everywhere now, inside me, surrounding me. It was alive, and it knew me better than I knew myself. It was the past, the forgotten things I had buried deep, the memories I had hoped would stay dead and buried. You're already here. You've always been here. The air around me crackled, and suddenly a flash of light broke through the darkness. For a moment it was blinding, and I squinted against it, trying to shield my eyes. When the light faded, I found myself standing in a familiar place, the old hallway, the one I had entered earlier. But it was different now. The walls were stained, the floor covered in dust and debris, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The door that had once been open was now closed, locked. And there, at the end of the hallway, was the figure. It was waiting. It's never over. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in place. The whispers had returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices, all pleading, all warning, all begging. Well, you can't escape it. You can't escape the past. I felt something cold touch my shoulder, and I turned, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, too many shadows, twisting, reaching for me. And then the figure moved closer. It's time to remember. The world around me shifted, the walls seemed to close in, and everything went black. I awoke with a start, gasping for air, but there was no relief. The air around me was thick, heavy, like the weight of 1,000 suffocating thoughts pressing down on my chest. I sat up quickly, the sensation of cold metal scraping against my skin. My hands shook as they gripped the surface beneath me, trying to steady myself. The surroundings were unfamiliar. I wasn't in the hallway anymore, nor was I in the void. I was in a room. A small, dimly lit room. The flickering of a single light bulb overhead cast long shadows against the walls, making the space feel even smaller, even more suffocating. The walls were lined with old, decaying wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing a damp, cracked surface beneath. The air smelled stale, like the remnants of forgotten years. I could barely see through the dust, but I could feel it, heavy and oppressive. My breath came in shallow bursts, but the panic that had gripped me only moments before was still present, lingering in the pit of my stomach. What was this place? It didn't look like any room I recognized, and yet it felt strangely familiar. The sense of déjà vu was almost suffocating, and my head spun as I struggled to piece together what had just happened. Was it a dream? No, it couldn't have been. The whispers, the figure, it had been real. I felt the terror rising again, but I fought it back, tried to ground myself. I took slow, deliberate steps toward the corner of the room, my mind racing with questions. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the quiet, far too loud for comfort. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beside a small, cracked window, a desk sat with stacks of old papers and books. The dust was thick on the surfaces, but there was something about the desk that caught my eye. A small, flickering light emanated from beneath the papers. I hesitated for only a moment, and then, driven by a sense of urgency, I moved toward it. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed aside the layers of yellowed paper and books that had piled up over the years. And there it was, a photograph. It was old, black and white, and the edges were frayed with age. The image showed a group of people standing outside an old house, their faces blurred, indistinguishable. But there was one face I could recognize, mine. I was there, standing in the center of the photo, a child's face staring back at me, too young, too innocent. My throat tightened as I stared at the photograph. I didn't remember this place. I didn't remember that day. But the feeling in my gut, that feeling of dread, told me it was all connected somehow. And then I noticed the writing on the back of the photo. It's already started. Don't let them in. The words were scrawled hastily, like a warning from someone who knew the truth, someone who had seen it all before. I turned the photo over in my hands, trying to make sense of the words, but my mind couldn't process it. I was still holding the photograph when the whispers returned. This time they weren't soft. They were sharp, urgent, and they were coming from everywhere. You shouldn't have found that. I spun around, heart racing. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in on me with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, no longer a distant murmur but clear, harsh words that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. You're too late. It's already begun. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My limbs were heavy, as if the very air in the room was pulling at me, weighing me down. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, darker, as if they were alive, moving, shifting. I could hear them, feel them, but I couldn't see what they were. They were just there. I backed away from the desk, but my eyes remained fixed on the photograph. There was something about it, something in my gut that told me I wasn't supposed to have seen it. That whatever this was, whatever this place was, it wasn't meant for me to uncover. I glanced at the window. The small crack in the glass, barely visible in the dim light, seemed to beckon me. Without thinking, I rushed to the window, my hands trembling as I tried to push it open. The glass was stuck, the years of neglect making it difficult to move. I could hear the whispers growing louder, could feel the pressure building, pushing me, pressing me to act. You shouldn't have come back. With a final, desperate shove, the window creaked open. A gust of cold air hit my face, carrying with it the scent of rain, of decay, of something old, something lost. I took in a deep breath, the chill sharp in my lungs, and stepped forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the moment I moved, the shadows shifted. They seemed to move toward me, growing larger, twisting into forms that didn't belong in this world. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were something else, something that wanted to consume me. Get out, the voice came again, clear and forceful. But it wasn't a whisper. This time it was a command. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My legs were frozen in place, my feet rooted to the ground. And then from the corner of the room, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the same figure from before. The tall, thin silhouette, its features still obscured by darkness, but its presence undeniable. It was here. It had been here all along. I couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, its long, spindly fingers reaching toward me, its form flickering in and out of existence. And with every step it took, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just voices anymore. They were screams. You should never have come back. My vision blurred and I collapsed, the weight of the shadows pressing in on me. And just before everything went black, I heard it, one final whisper. It's not over. When I awoke, it wasn't to the relief of unconsciousness, but to an unsettling stillness. My body ached as if every muscle had been strained beyond its limit, but there was something more disturbing than the physical pain. There was an absence, a quiet that hung thick in the air, pressing on me from all sides. I wasn't in the room anymore. The floor beneath me was cold, so cold it sent a shiver through my entire body. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, but the space around me remained shrouded in shadows. I could barely make out the outlines of the walls, but one thing was clear. I wasn't in any familiar place. I couldn't tell if I was indoors or outside. The air was damp, carrying the scent of mildew and wet stone, and yet there was a strange metallic tang in the air, like blood. I pushed myself up from the ground, my knees scraping against something rough, but the ache in my legs only seemed to deepen the sense of helplessness that had settled into my chest. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was as though the very act of speaking was forbidden here, as if the room itself consumed the sound. Where am I? I took a few unsteady steps forward, my hands trembling as they brushed along the cold, jagged walls. The faintest outline of what seemed like a doorway appeared in the distance. I couldn't make sense of the space, and it was getting harder to breathe. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, like invisible hands pressing down on my chest, restricting my ability to move. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. The creak of wood. The slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart began to race, and my body stiffened instinctively. I froze, eyes wide, searching through the haze of darkness for any sign of movement. It was coming closer. The sound grew louder, more pronounced, as though the very walls were shifting, breathing. And then from the shadows I saw it, a figure emerging slowly, its form indistinct, like a shadow stitched together from darkness itself. Its movements were fluid, unnatural. It wasn't walking. It was gliding as if it hovered just above the ground. The figure's edges seemed to blur with the air, distorting its true shape, but one thing was unmistakable. Its presence was suffocating. I could feel it watching me, the sensation crawling up my spine like cold fingers tracing my skin. No, not again. I stumbled backward, but my feet betrayed me. I tripped over something hidden in the dark and fell hard to the ground. The cold stone scraped my skin, and the shock of the impact jolted me upright. My hands reached out to steady myself, but they met only empty air. I scrambled to my feet, panicked, and tried to push myself further into the darkness, away from whatever was approaching me. The whispers returned. You shouldn't have come. They weren't distant this time. They were in my ears, as if the walls themselves were speaking, murmuring their twisted words directly into my mind. My pulse quickened as I tried to understand what they meant. It was like being caught in a nightmare that wouldn't end. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I struggled, the shadows kept coming, pulling me in. I looked back over my shoulder, terrified, and saw nothing but the endless expanse of blackness. But I knew it was there, somewhere just out of my line of sight, moving in the silence. I'm not alone. I had to get out. I didn't know where the door was or if there even was a door, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let that thing catch me. I forced my legs to move, stumbling blindly into the unknown. My breath was ragged, and every step felt as though the floor beneath me might give way, sending me plunging into darkness. And then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, everything stopped. Silent, complete silence. The world around me froze, as though time itself had stopped. My breath was the only sound I could hear. It was as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, for something to break the stillness. I stood motionless, trying to make sense of the situation. The sensation of being watched didn't go away, but I couldn't see the figure anymore. The whispers had faded into nothingness. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the walls again. They were cold, slick with moisture. The air smelled stagnant, yet it wasn't as thick as before. The weight pressing on my chest had lifted slightly, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. A sound, faint but distinct, broke the silence. The scrape of metal on stone growing louder with each passing second. It was back. The figure, the presence, whatever it was coming closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The very air around me seemed to ripple with its movement. It's here. I didn't wait to see it, to hear it. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body like a war drum. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay here any longer. The very thought of it, of being trapped in this suffocating place, with the figure hunting me, drove me forward. And then I saw it. A light. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It shone like a beacon in the dark, a promise of escape. I ran toward it, desperate. But the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the distance behind me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep going, to not stop, to not look back. But I couldn't help it. I turned my head just for a moment, just long enough to see the figure emerging from the shadows. Its face, or what passed for a face, was twisted and contorted, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. The whispers were louder now, growing into a maddening chorus. Well, you can't escape. I ran faster, harder. My legs were burning, but the light was closer now. I could see it more clearly, the soft glow illuminating what seemed to be a door. I reached for it, my hand outstretched, and just as I was about to turn the handle, I heard the whisper again. It's too late. But I didn't stop. Thank you for listening till the end. I hope you were able to relax and will now get a good rest. And don't worry, new stories are already on the way for tomorrow. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to stay connected. Now have a good night. See you in the next episode.